Those were the days.
Hey everyone, Justin Lee Harold here with another edition of Those Were the Days Extended. And today we're going to take a little bit of a deep dive into a very tragic character who unfortunately met his demise way too early. Started out as a really sort of hopeful figure and then was brought back in sort of just not treated very well in the grand scheme of days and soaps in general, and sort of got definitely the short end of the stick with this one. And of course, I'm talking about the unforgettable, very unfortunately short-lived character of Benjy Hawk Dimera. But what got me sort of down this road is I'm going to take you guys back to where here we are here. If you guys remember this was actually November 16th, 2006, when Benji returned to Salem. He basically came back because he surprised an amnesiac Steve, who had memory loss, and he wanted to sort of help him jog his memory. I don't know if you guys remember this period. This was when, sorry, let me go back here. This was when Steve came back to the show, had memory loss. Him and Kayla were poisoned, I believe by Stefano. This is also when Steve was getting, he was actually getting close to Billy Reed. I think she had even found him or brought him back, or I forget the circumstance of him coming back to the show, but this is when he sort of made his return from being presumed dead for all those years. And he didn't have his memory, didn't know who he was, didn't recognize Kayla or anyone else. And he was getting very close to Billy, and they were sort of starting, I wouldn't say starting a relationship, but they were starting to started to have feelings for each other. That was very short-lived, of course. Soon after this, he did get his memories back, and of course, reunited with Kayla for a short period of time there before something else happened. But Benji was brought in specifically during this time to help jog Steve's memory here. This is Jim Lumsford taking over the role from the actor who played child Benji 20-something years later. So this is adult Benji showing up to Steve's hospital room and trying to either jog his memory or convince him or see if there's like a glimmer of the old Steve / Patch there. And then this is Steve having these two photos in the middle here of young Benji with Kayla and Steve, and then a photo of young Benji when he was a kid on the show in the 80s, I believe. It was, I think it was 87 to 88 or 86 to 88. I'm forgetting. It was a 2-year stint that we had this Benji storyline, which I'll go into in a minute. But yeah, it sort of worked. Steve didn't get all his memories back from the scene, but running into Benji and having that connection from someone from way back then really did start to jog his memories, and at least he was starting to at least get the Benji memories back from here. And then from this is when it sort of, this was the impetus for it to sort of snowball in the storyline of Steve getting his memories back, him reuniting with Kayla, and then sort of going after the Dimera Stefano in particular here for what had happened. But yeah, kind of, again, send me down the road. I think Benji is one of those characters where if you didn't know of him, or if you either weren't watching the show or don't remember his stint on the show back in the 80s, or in 2006 when he came back for it was about a year's worth of storyline before again he had met his untimely demise, which we'll get into a little bit later. If you weren't watching during those periods of time and don't remember it, you may not remember him as a character, but he very much sort of suffered at the hands of his family, the Dimeras. Give you a little bit of backstory. Benji is the son of Stephen Hawk. Excuse me, he's the son of Stefano Dimera and Ellen Hawk here. Ellen Hawk, you may remember if you're watching back then, she was again on the show for about a year's worth, a few months back in 88, I believe, the later half of 88. She had a history with Stefano, of course. She had a history with her dad, which I'll get into in a minute. Roman knew her from back then. So yeah, she was a short-lived character on the show, but I think definitely made an impact in this storyline in what it was sort of going to be ushering in for Stefano in the late 80s there. This is sort of, this is when the Roman Stefano rivalry was sort of heating up. And again, it's hard to remember it in that way because a lot of Stefano's storylines moving forward involve John and the pawn and all that, and this actually does too in a weird way, which we'll get into. But yeah, that is Ellen Hawk, who is Benji's mom. But yeah, brief history. He's the deaf son of Stefano and Ellen Hawk. Ellen is the daughter of Orion Hawk, and this is where John also comes into play here in the beginning part of the pawn storyline. Basically, Ellen's dad, Orion, used to work for Stefano, and he's the one who actually trained both, or not both, but all. He trained John Black, Drew Donovan, and then Eduardo Hernandez, who is Rafe and Gabby's dad. So basically, if you remember the history of John, if you haven't, go check out my Those Were Days Extended on his history. If you remember that, he was taken from the assassin school and recruited by Stefano and trained, and Orion Hawk is actually the person who trained him, as well as Eduardo. And then again, Drew Donovan for a period, not at the same time, but definitely John Black and Eduardo at the same time. But yeah, so Orion, Orion, dad of Ellen Hawk, worked for Stefano, trained John Black, Drew Donovan, Eduardo Hernandez in martial arts and fighting. And basically, Ellen had an affair with Stefano. Ellen and Orion, her dad, sort of discovered what Stefano was up to. They really weren't hip to what his plans were and what his specifically his plans were with John Black and swapping him out with Roman. This was again the beginning sort of seeds of that storyline sort of coming into play here. But they weren't aware of that. Once they found out sort of what he was doing, they decided to distance themselves from Stefano and get away as far as possible. So Ellen, her dad Orion, and she took her son Benji and basically fled to the Orient. Benji and Ellen were trapped in this explosion that left Benji deaf basically for the rest of his life. It also separated Benji and Ellen at the time. Benji was found and went to a monastery to recover. That is when Steve and Kayla come into play, because if you remember, they were honeymooning in the Orient at the time. This is the late 80s after they had gotten married. And if you remember that storyline, when they got married, Kayla was suffering from memory loss and had learned sign language to kind of communicate. Her and Steve had got married. They go on their honeymoon. They visit this monastery. They meet this incredible little boy at the time named Benji. Kayla specifically connects with him because she had been dealing with her own hearing loss and connects with him, and they speak to each other in sign. And Steve, of course, who had learned ASL in order to communicate with Kayla. So they sort of connect with this little sort of interesting boy who's in this monastery. He doesn't have a home. Patch and Kayla are newly married. They're talking about starting a family and how they want their life to be. And they decide they want to basically adopt this boy, and they want Benji to basically come live with them in Salem. Benji comes, he lives with them. They take him back to Salem. Ellen eventually tracks him down, Ellen and Orion. They track him down there. They don't specifically, when Ellen finds him, she sort of makes a decision, talks with Steve and Kayla, lets them know her history. She doesn't specifically mention Stefano or that the person that she's hiding from is Stefano. She sort of describes him as a bad man who would take out vengeance and would take the kid and all that kind of stuff. So she doesn't specifically name him as Stefano. She doesn't even understand at that point, I think, the link that the Bradys, specifically Kayla and her family, and then Steve also, their connection to Stefano. So it's all very, sort of happenstance at this point. She makes a decision to not take Benji away. She actually wants Steve and Kayla to keep him, at least for the time being, until she feels like the threat of Stefano has been neutralized, or that she feels like he's not after, or at least looking for her and her family again. So the decision is that Benji stays there. While Ellen is in town, she kind of runs into Roman, or spots Roman, doesn't want him to see her because then she'll make the connection to Stefano. She kind of avoids him, which she shouldn't have. She kind of actually could have used him for help. Stefano spots her in Salem. He unfortunately has her killed. She is killed. Benji eventually ends up staying with Steve and Kayla for a little while. They begin to sort of raise him as their own. All the while, Stefano is sort of plotting to sort of take him away. He realizes that Ellen is in town. Steve and Kayla have this new son named Benji, who of course is who he's been looking for, trying to find her, this his mysterious son, and then the grandfather. Like I said, Stefano had her killed, and then Steve and Kayla sort of continue raising Benji for a little while. This is where this is Stefano at his most evil. This is him ramping up with his revenge against the Bradys. If you're watching at that time, Benji was a big staple in the Brady sort of family. Both him and Carrie were raised together. So Carrie at this point is on the scene with Roman and Anna Antonia and all those. And then Benji and Carrie were really raised as cousins and really good friends at this point. And they were routinely the target of Stefano's attempted kidnappings. I think he kidnapped them more than once. I remember one time in particular, he took Benji to punish, of course, Kayla and Steve. And then, of course, he routinely would threaten to take Carrie, if you remember at that time, because she was the daughter of Roman. She was also the stepdaughter of Tony, who at this point is with Anna. And so Carrie was very much, you wouldn't know it if you came onto the show in the 90s, because Carrie was very much distanced and not associated with the Dimeras, but she very much, when she was younger, very much melted into that family along with the Bradys and then John and Marlena. A very central character even as a young child back then. But yes, she routinely was threatened whenever Stefano sort of wanted to punish like John, Marlena, Tony, or Anna. Carrie was sort of in his bullseye, so to speak, as a way to sort of get back at them. But one time in particular, he did kidnap Carrie and Benji. They eventually got him back. It all sort of ended. There was so much drama and worry there that it sort of ended with a sort of weird sort of ceasefire where Benji, Orion, Ellen's dad, Benji's grandfather, came into Salem, wanted to take Benji back to Europe to be raised. There was sort of this ceasefire with everybody. Steve and Kayla sort of recognized that was probably the best place for him. Stefano, probably out of guilt and anger, or guilt specifically for what he had done to Benji's mom, Ellen, sort of allowed Benji to be raised by the grandfather, Orion. Also, probably a little bit of loyalty to Orion in terms of what he had done for training John Black, and he knew that sort of that plan was going into motion. So part of it was a little let me sort of pacify sort of Orion and not rock the boat too much here. So yeah, Benji sort of left at the tail end of the 80s, be raised by his grandfather in Europe. Steve and Kayla sort of moved on. They eventually had Stephanie, and then Joey, of course. But yeah, this is again predated Stephanie. So Benji was essentially sort of their first child, and that is why we're bringing it back to that first this first photo here. Why I think Benji was used as a way to sort of jog Steve's memory and bringing him back here, just because they had such a special connection and relationship when Benji was young. But yeah, sort of that was sort of the beginning part of Benji Hawk Dimera. They decided again to bring him back at this point just because Steve and Kayla were going to become a bigger presence on the show. You know, Steve was dead, quote unquote, dead for all those years. They decided to bring him back in the storyline. And so what better time to bring Benji back and sort of mix things up? We had, we were revving up this Steve and Kayla rivalry with the Dimeras again, with Stefano. And then what better way to sort of ignite that than to sort of, in a weird way, take it back to where it started with their sort of quasi-adopted son, Stefano's biological son, who they all sort of share. But yeah, so Benji did come back. Steve eventually got his memories back. Benji, we figure out from that storyline early on that Benji was very much in contact with Celeste. You guys remember Celeste? She had kept in contact with Benji throughout the years in his raising and the grandfather. And she, when he found out, I remember the scene so clearly, when she found out he was back in town, they had this scene with them at lunch. And then she very much was urging him to go into hiding to keep him safe. If you remember, at this time, Celeste is sort of at the tail end of her trials and tribulations with Lexi. She's still, the push and pull of the Dimera side with her trying to keep Lexi good and on the straight and narrow. And at this point, Lexi was very much on the straight and narrow. This is very much after the Lexi goes evil storyline. But she had just sort of gotten her life back. She's good with Abe, and sort of, I think Celeste saw what Lexi went through and actually did not want the same thing to happen to Benji. So she very much was trying to get him to take his wife and his son, who they revealed that he had, very much sort of go into hiding and to keep them safe and away from the Demiras. She thought nothing good could happen. She was happy that he and Lexi had a relationship and were, had connected as brother and sister, but she sort of very much urged him to stay out of Salem and to go back to Europe and sort of with his family. Benji was sort of blackmailed in a horrible way by his father, Stefano, to sort of mix it up and stay in town. He even convinced Benji to deliver this death sort of tarot card to Steve to sort of warn him and put him on the defensive for Steve and Kayla. Benji eventually came clean and told Steve and Kayla Stefano had been basically threatening his wife and family. And so this was sort of, everything was sort of bubbling to the surface here of how it eventually came apart. But while in town, Benji decided, despite all that, he wanted to stay. He eventually had his wife, who is Sonia Hawk here, come to Salem. That's when he revealed to Steve and Kayla that he had a wife, of course, and a son named Stephen Hawk, that he named after Steve, because he, always saw Steve and Kayla as two of his parents and always had a parental sort of connection with them, and that stuck with him throughout the years of growing up, even though he grew up with his grandfather in Europe. So this is sort of Benji at happier times when he came back to Salem and was trying to sort of make a little bit of a home there for him. And then when the stuff with sort of Stefano happened, he sort of sent his wife and kids away. He thought it was finally a little bit too dangerous for them. He sent them away. And then sort of this is when sort of the unraveling happened. This was a lot of stuff in a very short amount of time. I think that I remember this, we as a fans thought like, oh, we're getting sort of Benji back. We're sort of building up the Dimera children again. At this point on canvas, we had Tony, we had Andre, we had EJ, of course. Chad was on the show, but I can't remember if he was revealed to be a Dimera at this point. I can't remember. And then Lexi, of course. Also an interesting time because Stefano was very much on the outs with all of his children, except for Andre at the time, who he still believed, if I remember correctly, still believed to be his nephew. Andre wasn't revealed to be wasn't revealed to be Stefano's son at that point. And all of the children, again, were on the outs with Stefano. He was sick at the time. He needed sort of a liver transplant. And he basically needed one of his biological children to do that. Lexi had refused. He was on the outs with EJ because I believe they were fighting over Dimera. EJ was sort of torn between wanting to do it and not wanting to do it. Of course, that put the out. Again, yes, they didn't know it was Andre didn't know that he was father because Andre was still believed to be the nephew. And then Tony, of course, who we know is not actually Stefano's biological son, he was on the outs, of course, because he wasn't a biological child. Kristen at the time was not on canvas yet. Again, she is an adopted child as well, so she wouldn't be a match. So it really sort of came down to his biological children, again, who he was on the outs with. Andre sort of forced or kidnapped Benji, basically took part of his liver to help with the donation, and sort of left him very cruelly in a dumpster. Sort of did not care about Benji, did not sort of recognize him as a true Dimera because he was good, and he unfortunately there was a bias because he was deaf at the time, and Andre saw that as a weakness. So he found Benji to be the most disposable out of the children. I don't think he was really ever going to touch Lexi. And EJ was sort of a force to be reckoned with. So I think he saw Benji as the most expendable at that point. So yeah, took the donation, left him in a dumpster to die. Benji was found. He was brought to the hospital. And then we have this picture here I found with him and Lexi. This was sort of, was it pop up? Yeah, here we go. This was sort of when he was found. I think a stranger found him, and then Bo, who he had been forming a friendship with, was the one to bring him in. Here's Lexi at his bedside here. Once he eventually sort of came to and realized what had happened, I think he just snapped. He had enough. He had only been in Salem a short time at that point, but had sort of had enough of the Dimeras. I think he thought this was going to be a way for him to forge a relationship with his siblings. He had gotten close to Lexi, which was great. He had a relationship with Celeste. He had a relationship with Tony. EJ, he was sort of getting to know at that point. I think what helped was that, again, EJ was on the outs with Stefano, so I think that that allowed him and Benji to have a relationship. Yes, Benji woke up again, found out what happened to him, sort of snapped, left from the hospital, went to this sort of mock funeral that Stefano had staged while he was in recovery, so that people thought he had died. His plan was to recover and sort of come back as strong as ever and sort of make his presence known that way. Benji burst into the mock funeral with a gun and basically shot at the casket just because he had been fed up and sort of, he had been at his wit's end and just snapped. And, here he was at the end, suffering from the Dimeras. His mother had been killed. He was forced to sort of be taken away from Steve and Kayla, grew up in Europe with his grandfather who had recently passed, came to Salem to sort of start a new life and thought things, he'd have a second chance of what he had lost out on the first run back in the 80s when he was sort of not taken away, but sort of went to live with his granddad and said goodbye to Steve and Kayla. He was disarmed, of course, brought back to the hospital, and this is when Andre sort of feared being found out for what he did, kidnapped Benji, and basically buried him alive and killed him. This was not done on Stefano's orders. When Stefano found out, he was incredibly pissed and angry at Andre that he took it that far. And then we had this scene that Benji was actually even found by Steve here. And wait, here we go. Yeah. Found that Steve here, he had found the coffin, taken Benji out, and sort of was trying to give him CPR to resuscitate him. It didn't work. This is Steve sort of breaking down at a dead Benji, essentially his first/oldest child being killed. And that's when that sent Steve on a rampage. He eventually kidnapped Stefano and wanted to kill him. He unfortunately was talked down from that, but yeah, that unfortunately is sort of the tragic sort of life and death of Benji Hawk Dimera. He is very seldom brought up, unfortunately. He very much has, when it was one of those Dimeras, very similar to Lexi, very similar to Renee, very similar to Megan until she came back, was very much a product of their demise was a product of being a Dimera and sort of being in this family and suffering the consequences of it. Yeah, this was what we do know of Benji, or what is left of his memory, is he's very seldom brought up, unfortunately. Tony may bring him up every once in a while, or sometimes Chad does, or if Lexi were still alive, he'd probably be brought up more. But we do know his widow is still out there, Sonia, and his son is still out there. His son has actually been mentioned a lot more in the last few years. We know that he is an adult. He would be a little, maybe a couple years at this point older than like Johnny. So we're thinking like late 20s he is. He's still involved, not involved with Dimera, but he has his Dimera shares because when we had sort of the fighting of the sea to be fighting to see who can be CEO, he very much lodged his support with Gabby. So he's very close with Gabby. We haven't seen him on the canvas yet. Fingers crossed we get Stephen Hawk makes his appearance sometime soon. We do, again, like I said, he has shares in Dimera, so he can also be brought back there. We have his mom, Sonia Hawk, who we saw in that picture earlier. She's still alive. Maybe she hates the Dimeras and wants vengeance on them. Who knows? That could be a storyline in the future. But yeah, that was sort of the tragic and unfortunate life of Benji Hawk Dimera. Like I said, his legacy now is with his son, so we'll see if he becomes a character in the future. But yeah, that was one of Stefano's probably a little bit lesser known children. Again, brief stint in the 80s, as a young child, but made an impression, especially with Steve and Kayla, and then had a brief stint in the early 2000s when they brought him back as an adult. So yeah, if you didn't know, if you have any Benji memories of those, either one of those storylines when he was younger or brought back as an adult, please comment below. Be nice to reminisce about him. But yeah, that was this week's Those Were Days, and I will see you guys next time. Thanks. Bye.
Those were the days.